things you can see in our space is when somebody says you're taking a vote for Wall Street, they're not voting for that. They've got to sneak in riders and provisions in the dead of night because they can't get it done during the day. And that's why doing what we do in each of our spheres and the overlap is so important. Because
or they block regulations. Like in the book, I think I said that as of the end of 2017, a third of the regulations that were supposed to be written for Dodd-Frank, which again was passed in 2010, so 2017 is a lot of time, still hadn't been written. They were bottled up because they were being lobbied up. Is that still about the?
It's roughly.
Yeah, well,
right.
now they're being written back. You know,
Right.
They're being pulled back. But
See, I think that part of like the theory of change discussion here depends upon how you actually see members of Congress. And if you see them as basically corrupt people who are here to feather their own beds and then cash out to K Street, then that's one view. But we did just in 2017 alone, did 170 meetings on the Hill, 170 different congressional offices, 70% of which were with Republican offices. My board member JB just got done doing, 5 or 6 today with various members of Congress. What I've seen with members, both former and current, is actually that they are mainly decent people. You might disagree with them on policy, but they are mainly decent people stuck inside of a horrible system. And where you see this the most, and this is what gives me the most amount of hope, is with new members of Congress. What happens is they arrive in Washington, they believe that they are there to legislate, to talk about policy and evidence, not just influence. And instead, they're immediately told by leadership, hit the phones and start fundraising, because you've got to raise at least $3 million for the re-elect, you've got to deliver X amount of money to the RNC or the DNC, you've got to set up a leadership pact, and by the way, there are probably a couple of super PACs that you could be helpful with too. And what happens is that, like a smoker who's taking the first couple puffs of a cigarette, they're choking on it. They start coughing, and they say, this is not why I'm here. This is not right. And they have an important moral reaction that occurs at that moment. And then what happens is that eventually over time they do start setting up the leadership pack, and they start doing the fundraising, they can begin imagining being a committee chair, and they're a part of the system. So part of it is to get them when they're still fresh. And what you see, whether it's Mike Gallagher, who's a Republican member of Congress, 36 years old, Marine Corps, Princeton grad from Green Bay, Wisconsin, or whether you talk about a guy like Derek Kilmer on the Democratic side, who is one of the most thoughtful people I've ever met. He worked in a highly functional state legislature in Washington before he came to DC. He saw how governing actually worked. That whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, what both of these folks, what bonds them together, and the reason why we're working with both of them, is because they both are still choking on the smoke. And that's increasingly what, where we're finding the most amount of traction.
That's certainly true. The guy I wrote about who, with the I don't give a, Post-it note, he feels imprisoned.
Yep.
And, I said, well, why don't you say something about it? Well, he said, I'm getting close to where I want to, but they're trapped. And I actually, I am really hopeful. I think that that you're all right in the sense that sooner or later things are just going to snap, because they do. And when they do, it's going to be because of people like these folks who have stayed at it when everybody else thought they were just wasting their time or couldn't get a job doing something else. That it's because of all the work they've done that the country's going to be prepared to be, it's going to have the information and the direction that it needs to make the kinds of changes we're talking about.
Though we don't have all the information, because part of the fundraising frenzy is that dark money groups, super PACs, and non-disclosing nonprofits may drop millions of dollars.
Right, but you do stuff like go to office buildings and look at building directories and find links. It's really, really great stuff. So let me ask you each one more question.
Can I just quickly add on what Steve said?
Because we're running out of time.
Well, I was just going to say, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse was actually here. You talk about good policy. He was here for about 20 minutes. I'd be remiss if I didn't say he was here. But, you're talking about politicians trapped in a bad system. very good, hardworking, earnest people. I think Senator Sheldon Whitehouse from
Yeah.
Rhode Island, who actually wrote a
Wrote
similar
a very
book about
good
a year
book,
ago called Captured,
Yeah.
was here. And in our space, the problems you identified are compounded because of the unbelievable lack of knowledge and sophistication about the economy and finance. People think Wall Street is this thing up there in the financial system they don't understand. And so they become actually dependent on lobbyists because
Totally.
we don't pay staff, we don't pay members, we don't give them enough staff. So to get anything done when they're not raising money and they're in the room, they got a few staff who are, and I was staff, so all staff are really good, but there's only so many of them.
No, there's this story I tell where the most indefensible tax loophole probably can all agree is, the carried interest loophole where, if you work, your carried interest in a private equity fund or hedge fund is treated as capital gains. Anyway, when Dodd-Frank was being debated, as you well know, they tried to reform that. And whatever the trade association is for private equity funds, I'm sure you can, you know all those guys in your sleep. They produced this wonderful, this really glossy bound thing. I think they got McKinsey or someone to do it. They got a consulting firm to do it. And it had all these graphs and all these tables. And, basically, if the carried interest loophole were not preserved, 2/3 of America was going to be out of work. And they had all these graphs. And when I looked at the footnotes, it was all bullshit. I mean, it just, the numbers didn't even add up. It was just, but it was glossy and it had a great name on it.
Pictures of happy people.
And I said to one of the lobbyists, I said, this stuff just doesn't make any sense. This is just, this is garbage. He said, it doesn't matter. He said, what we do is we go see a congressman, we give him something like this, and his staff gives him 2 sentences to say on the floor about why he can, be with us on this. And he thinks it looks good and it kind of looks good. And it just gives him something that is defensible. And, he doesn't know what carried interest is. He probably doesn't even know what capital gains treatment is, for all we know. So let me ask you each one question. What's your annual budget, Nick?
$3 million.
What could you do with $6 million? Don't say twice as much.
We would probably we could increase our Hills legislative staff tenfold, and then have enough money left over to launch a decent-sized advocacy campaign in New Hampshire and Iowa to try to get fixing the political system on the radar for 2020.
Sheila, what about you? What's your annual budget now?
Annual budget is about 2.2 million, and what we could do with additional funds would be to supercharge the dark money sleuthing. We're extending our work following these non-disclosing nonprofits to the state level. So we're working with our first state, but we'd like to expand that. So this pilot project could be extended to all the states where the dark money is definitely flowing in as we speak. Personal financial disclosures. We know that there's a lot of personal enrichment in the executive branch that is comparatively more, and we'd like to expand our research on that. That is an unfunded project at this point. And finally, tracking the both donors and candidates who are newly engaged, particularly women. There's so much energy, both in terms of female candidates running, female donor organizations getting involved, and we're tracking now a new project to track both the gender and race of candidates to bring to bear data that does not yet exist.
Before I ask Dennis, just think of the amazing leverage here. A couple $1 million, $2-3 million. I think when I was writing the part of the book where I put what your annual budget was, I happened to be reading the Politico Playbook that day, and there was just a little note. I think it was, Chevron had announced a new congressional PAC that had raised, and it was like the exact amount of money of your annual budget. So
maybe I should call them.
It's amazing how far they go with their money. And what's your
We're at 3 million. If we had 3 million more, we'd put $1 million into increasing our substantive staff so that we could have expertise in more areas. We'd spend $1 million doing what Nick just alluded to, which is injecting our issues into the congressional and presidential races. And we'd spend $1 million in building a grassroots kind of membership to support the substantive work we're doing here.
So if any of you don't give money to these people, you should feel really bad. And if you do, you should double it.
Everybody with an extra million, raise your hand.
Just one last note before we take some questions. The book has a picture section. Now, the reason I think of that and the reason it's relevant is at one point, my assistant asked each of them to send a picture or where we could get a good picture of you. And Sheila emailed me saying, you really shouldn't do that. I'm not the story. The story is the issue. I really believe that these people are the story because it takes people to have the resilience that is necessary and is going to be necessary. And they are a big part of my book because they really are a story. They are a redeeming story about this country. And I just want to thank you for being here.
Steve, will you come on our funder visits with us in the
No.
future?
Only if each donor has to buy 100 books is part of the deal. Anyway, let's take some questions for me or for our panelists. Yeah.
Hi. One of the recurring themes in your book is these progressive reforms, which then 10 or 20 or 30 years later, some clever, well-moneyed influence power manages to twist to sort of further entrench their vote. So I guess my question to the panel is, which progressive reform are people pushing today, which 30 years from now is going to boomerang back to us?
Well, let me just make one comment about that before I turn. What I really try to say strenuously in the book, that this is not, in most cases, there are exceptions, this is not in most cases a story of evil people turning something good toward, their evil purposes. I don't think that the person, who invented mortgage-backed securities woke up one morning and said, I'd really like to invent something that in 20 years is just going to kill the American economy and I'm going to get rich. It's more a matter of this all happened kind of in slow motion through steady progress until it was no longer progress. It's a very good idea that, drugstores should be able to advertise that they give discounts. It's just when that sort of moves down the continuum to where it is today, it's different. My answer to your question is I still think that the looming, one of the looming issues is the continued use of the First Amendment for corporations to evade all kinds of regulation, including one of my favorite issues, which is the marketing of drugs. And I think that can be nailed on the merits with legislation. The campaign finance piece of it, I actually think, unlike Nick, that really requires a constitutional amendment. Because I think Citizens United was actually kind of right. And even if it was wrong, it doesn't stop a Tom Steyer or the Koch brothers from donating all their personal money to campaigns. But I'll let you guys go.
It's interesting. I read the book carefully, and much of it resonated with me from work as a former staffer for Senator Kennedy, fighting the drug companies, and having been a partner at Skadden Arps. I seem to, Where's Waldo appear in different places. And I thought hard about this because Ralph Nader and Alan Morrison is here. When Ralph Nader was fighting for the disclosure of drug prices so that people could compare and get better prices, he wasn't thinking 30 years later. And so when you say what is it, it's happening now, it's hard to know. Although Steve Hall, who's our legal director, is here. We often talk when we're taking positions in court, how can this be used against us? How is this going to come back and bite us? And in fact, we often use the phrase boomerang. We often say, where's the boomerang? Now, you can't always see them, but you do have to think about, Ralph was not a dummy. Ralph was at the top of his game with the top team you could possibly get at the time. Some boomerangs you can't see because they're perfectly not only well-intentioned, but they actually have a very important public good at that moment.
They have merit. There is a lot of merit to the argument that the First Amendment is as much, if not more, about the right to hear stuff or read stuff as it is the right to speak. So the listener's rights are really important.
In campaign finance, it's often said the left innovates and the right takes advantage of the innovation. So super PACs, non-disclosing nonprofits, if one side is to stand down, the other side would run roughshod over them. But it's a losing game in the end. So I don't think anybody. It's not popular, but unless there is leadership to show a path away from this enormous, funnel of money, this whooshing sound of millions of dollars, that's where we're at.
By the way, you do know that PACs and super PACs were a creation of the labor unions, not corporations, as a way to get around restrictions on unions themselves donating.
Yeah, and the first major exploitation of a 501c4 was the Democrats, who pieced together Americans coming together. Remember ACT, which was put together by a group of labor unions and others to back John Kerry's candidacy. That was I think they raised $70 or $90 million.
And then came Swift Boat Veterans for Truth.
Right, exactly, yeah. My biggest concern about this moment is that I think that we are entering an inflection point, and I think that we could try to put together a big deal. My fear is that it's going to end up being that we're either going to all stay in our silos, and people are going to talk about transparency and ethics, and people are going to talk about gerrymandering, and people are going to talk about money and politics, and we actually, again, I want to push this idea that we actually have a tremendous teachable moment right now to try to tell a comprehensive and broader story to the public about why the tower of democracy is wobbling so much, and to rush in with solutions that, a slate of solutions that actually fit together in their minds. Otherwise, what I fear is that you'll end up with a bunch of piecemeal reforms that will just, it'll take the Swiss cheese that already is the campaign finance and ethics system, plug a couple holes up, but you still end up with a system that's, leading the wrong way and that people don't believe in.
I have a question over there. Yeah.
Issue 1. It sounds as if you concluded that the single best place to start to fix what you're identifying is in the campaign finance system. Is that right?
I think issue 1 is aptly named, if that's your question.
And so my first question is that issue?
Yeah.
Is it hopeless? All the other issues you talk about.
No. I mean, I think it's not necessarily binary. Can we do that? Can't we do that? There are, as you know better than anyone, in fact, I think you wrote the white paper on this, if memory serves. There are states that are doing all kinds of reforms that can show the way. But so I don't think it's hopeless if nothing gets done, and I don't think there's necessarily a definition of nothing getting done. But I do think that there's a confluence. I think Nick is really right that there's a whole sort of there's a confluence of all the interests represented here and the other groups that I write about in the book, including the Partnership for Public Service, which is also here, the Bipartisan Policy Center, even the training programs that I cite. And what brings them together, again, is this notion of the protected versus the unprotected. That what we've lost in this country is a balance between striving and personal achievement, the kind that is vital for a free market and a capitalist economy, and is the energy of this economy and the energy of this country. A balance between that and spending some time and some effort also being concerned about the common good, and then the notion that everybody therefore is in some way responsible for the common good. And most important, and the place where Dennis works, is if you violate the common good, if your conduct isn't reined in, and you violate the common good, you have to be accountable. There's no accountability in the financial sector. One of the things I write about is that the people at the top have scored a trifecta of non-accountability. First, the big banks were too big to fail, so they had to be bailed out. Then they were too big to jail. And then, as we saw, the people, emphasize people, CEOs and board members at the top of the banks were able to convince prosecutors that the banks were too big to manage. And therefore, you could not prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt that anyone at the top knew any of the bad stuff that was going on, because how were they supposed to know? They have all these employees and all these offices. So I didn't know about that. So we have to restore that sense of accountability too. And I think all the work that they're doing and others are doing is aimed in that direction. Yes, right there. We only have time for one or two more.
What impresses me is that very little of what we all want to accomplish be accomplished without building support at the base, and very little effort is being spent by the national organizations to do just that. To solve this problem is going to require the kind of effort that the civil rights movement had, the women's movement had, the gay movement had, across the country, organizing in order to be able to get this across. The common folk, according to our various surveys, are 85% with us on this question. But we have not found out a way to organize them and to educate them at the local level so that they can come into the election and force change. We cannot force change from Washington. It has to be from the base.
Well, but I also think it's relevant. I agree with you, but I also think it's relevant that we don't have any political leaders who have been able to connect with people on these issues. And I mean, really, connect. And my principal a sense of the challenge there is to connect with both the middle class and the poor, who have much more in common, especially now because the middle class is increasingly becoming poor. And programs like the food stamp program are a middle class program. And the occupant of the White House got there because he was able to convince the middle class that the biggest threat they had was from poor immigrants, not from the opposite. So I think that's a big part of it. And leaders have to be willing to talk about these issues and to put their money where their mouths are, like to walk the talk of campaign finance reform, or walk the talk of Wall Street reform and everything else. Time for one more, right there.
Stand up in the hopes that it's me. Yeah, I think that when you touch on the grassroots stuff, it's really essential. You can have campaign finance reform, but if it doesn't get down to people who need to vote, who aren't voting, and I guess I have a question related to linking groups. How do you use the political parties to move this agenda instead of just each of our small individual brilliant, I had one, brilliant small efforts? How do we link it together? It's happening in the movement on the streets. I'm now a precinct captain in Northern Virginia, and it's fun. So it's happening. Everybody's working on the ground together. So I just really encourage.
So let each you take a shot at that.
Can I just hop in with a comment on recent polling done by, and there are others in the room who can probably speak more knowledgeably about this, but Open the Government conducted polling, focus groups in Pittsburgh and in the South. And what they found is people very much want accountability. They do not like the word oversight, and they certainly don't want any mention of parties. Once you mention a party, it is polarized. That, you've lost any possibility of kind of reaching people. They've already made up their mind. Similarly with Trump, don't mention Trump, because that closes minds instantly. So I think you're all right. Mike Peabody's right. We need the grassroots, but there is no cavalry who's coming to rescue us. We all are the cavalry. So we need to engage people, I think, in very basic ways, kind of get back to basics. Nobody's doing a better job than Trump to mobilize people for and against Trump to engage with their political system.
Dennis, anything to add?
Well, the only thing I'd say is you're absolutely right. I mean, ultimately, it's going to be voters voting in numbers. People say, well, the NRA is powerful because of money. The NRA is really powerful because of votes in key districts that they mobilize, election in and election out, and that's necessary and important. But there's also a space. I mean, we're in the trenches here fighting substantively at the agencies where almost nobody can even spell SEC, never mind know it stands for the Securities and Exchange Commission, but it dramatically impacts the livelihoods and prosperity of millions of Americans, as well as the health and safety of the financial system, and whether or not the financial system works to serve Main Street or is merely a bonus-driven system to enrich already rich people. And so I think there should be a combination of both, and you can't do one or the other. It's almost like a false choice to say you must do one or the other. Frankly, you've got to do both. But at the end of the day, you have to have votes. People have to get activated, and people have to vote their principles. And it gets back to ultimately making the case for the common good. I mean, the financial system in Wall Street is meant to serve and facilitate the common good and broad-based prosperity, not merely enrich already rich financiers. And that's a case that can be made. That's not necessarily going to get, a dozen precinct captains working. And so you need a combination of them both fighting in the policymaking process. I think of it as kind of until the restoration happens, or whatever that's supposed to be, so that the land is not laid to waste before the restoration happens.
So
Nick,
I think
final
that,
word.
yeah. So I think that what we've got to do is put a big deal together that has enough bipartisan support that we can make it a defining issue of the 2020 cycle. The easiest way to get the public engaged in this is through the ballot box. It's through leaders. It's through the electoral process. We don't collectively have enough money to run a $100 million grassroots campaign. None of us combined could ever imagine what that's like. So instead, we kind of have to inject something at the top, try to find some leaders who can back it, Republican and Democrat, and then make sure that it is an issue, a defining issue, and a defining part of the conversation in 2020. So they're coming out of 2020, one of the top 3, preferably, if not top 5 issues is fixing the broken system and beginning to restore our democracy. It's a little bit more of an elite play, just out of a sheer recognition of how long it would take for us to assemble the money to do a total grassroots play. But I think the grassroots can come into it as long as it's alive within the context of 2020. But I will close simply by saying that when Steve asked us about our budgets, the other thing, there aren't any major donors in the room here, but there are a lot of people who work at the groups that do the work. It's all of our faults that we're underfunded, okay? Because unless we're capable of producing a vision and a strategy that is compelling to capture the imaginations of the donors, and unless we are capable of laying out how much that strategy would cost and what we're capable of accomplishing with a surge in resources, then they're not all going to suddenly come along and parachute down on our front lawns and say, hey, I've got $20 million, what would you like to do with it? There's a chicken egg thing here. So I think that when we talk about needing to go big, and we do, we first have to get our own kind of ducks in a row here and begin communicating that compellingly to the donor class.
With that as our final word, I'd like to thank you guys for having me, and thank you all for coming.
And buy the book. Buy the book.